Have you ever been in a situation where you're approaching a group of friends or a circle of people you know and you want to join the conversation, but as you get close to them, everyone suddenly stops talking and they're like looking down kind of awkwardly. You don't really want to ask them what's up because you know they were just talking about you. It doesn't feel good. I've been in that situation, and I've also been one of the people in the circle who was doing the talking about the person who entered the circle. Even in that position, it feels gross. Why? Is it because I was being judgmental? Does that make me a hypocrite? Hypocrites are the worst. No one appreciates hypocrisy. Somehow it's everywhere, even in the church where values like forgiveness, compassion, mercy, love are held super high. So what's the deal with hypocrisy and judgmentalism? Why is it such a big deal in the church? And how do we escape it? That's what we're talking about this week at Session, Season 1, Episode 2, Hypocrisy and Judgmentalism. Blech. Yuck. Now, I'm gonna have to give a confession before I get started on this because I am a hypocrite. Ugh. Doesn't feel good to say. The values I talk about having, the values that I actually act out are sometimes really different. Anyways, that's my perspective and I can talk more about that later, but right now let's talk about someone else. If we're going to talk about the way Jesus talked about hypocrisy and judgmentalism, we should understand that those are really two different things. When Jesus talked about judgmentalism, he was using a word that basically means to make a decision if something is right or wrong. But when Jesus talked about hypocrisy, he was pretty much just describing a pretender, a fake. And every time he uses it, it's pretty much always a bad thing. A case study could be in the book of Matthew, chapter 23, where Jesus calls out a group of people who obviously care more about appearing right than actually living right. He just straight up calls them hypocrites, like 6 times in a row. Jesus is actually publicly judging them as hypocrites, but he's not being a hypocrite because Jesus himself does actually live a right life. That Matthew 23 passage is the perfect example of just how radically opposed Jesus is to hypocrisy. Like, he really hates it. And just studying for this session, I found 10 other examples where Jesus publicly slams people for being hypocrites. So yeah, it's a big deal to him. It's kind of interesting though, because hypocrisy and judgmentalism wasn't always a big deal. Like if you go backwards 2,000 or even 4,000 years from there, you can see a lot of this phrase going around, like in Deuteronomy 12:8, where it says, everyone doing whatever seems right in his own eyes. That was kind of the standard way of doing judgment at that time. And that kind of judgment sounds kind of nice to us, but in the Bible, we see it had some really sad outcomes. And those sad stories emphasize a problem that God diagnoses in places like Genesis 6:5 and Jeremiah 17:9 and Romans 1:25. I'll paraphrase it. We are bad judges because in our heart, we lie to ourselves about what is right so that we can have what is gratifying. It's a really sad reality, and learning just how true that reality is takes up a big chunk of the Bible. So God makes a few big promises, 2 really important things. Number 1, God himself is personally coming as king to judge all of our bad works. And number 2, God himself is personally coming as a sacrificial savior to save us from all of the bad judgments against us. And that's why another big chunk of the Bible is filled with passages that say things like, to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear, your God will come, and he will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. So after God gave these big promises, people's attitude towards judgment started to flip a little. And during a period known as the 400 years of silence, people started to put their own judgy spin on God's plan, which effectively just remixed the problem of taking what is right and replacing it with what is gratifying, except for this time, it's taking the shape of religion. They would judge things like how far is too far to walk to church, and exactly what percentage of your spice cupboard should you separate just for spiritual use only, and what categories of childhood rebellion were considered holy. These are real things that they would judge over. These were actually real things that they put real religious judgments on. Jesus hated this, and in his own words he says, You crush people with unbearable religious demands, and you never lift a finger to ease the burden. They had obsessed and confused the godly act of judgment and had completely forgotten the godly act of grace. But the diagnosis hadn't changed. They were still bad judges, and in their hearts they were still lying to themselves and replacing what is right with something that was gratifying. That's why in places like John 6 and Luke 9, when people ask Jesus, what do we have to be doing the works of God? He doesn't give them a list of good things and bad things. He says it's not about what you can do to impress God. His standard of judgment is perfect, and His saving grace is sufficient to cover your failures. Trust Him, follow Him, even if it means dying, because, spoiler alert, Jesus conquers death. All right, if that's all true, it sounds pretty good. Would have been really nice if the early church would have just listened to Jesus' solution for hypocrisy and judgmentalism, but sadly, that's not what happens. Actually, even during a time that most Christians consider to be the most pure moment in history for the church, even St. Peter himself, the guy who Jesus says is the rock that he'll build the church on, turns out to be a hypocrite sometimes. And it's not surprising because the problem hasn't changed. Our hearts still lie to us about what is right and what is gratifying. And if religion is something that we do, then religion is just going to be the way through which we express our hypocrisy to get what we want. And that's the reality throughout all of Christian history. Indulgences had nothing to do with trusting the perfect judgment and saving grace of God. They were about trying to fund the properties and projects of the church, and so deceived hearts replace what is right for what's gratifying to get what they want. The Crusades were not about trusting the perfect judgment and saving grace of God. They were about trying to unify European governments and make people feel okay about the bad things they were doing. And so deceived hearts replaced what's right for what's gratifying. Residential schools here in Canada had nothing to do with trusting the perfect judgment and saving grace of God. It was about making Indigenous people fit inside white settlers' system. And so deceived hearts replaced what is right with what was gratifying at the time. And what about for us today? What about in our culture? The air that we breathe is fogged up with hypocrisy and judgmentalism. Some philosophers are calling it outrage culture or ally theater. It's basically where some of us just stomp around the internet looking for some corporation or politician or celebrity or any regular old villain to publicly shame and completely lose our marbles on. Why? Why do we do that? Maybe it's because pointing out the worst things in other people makes us feel okay about the kind of bad things in our life. I don't know. But from the Bible's perspective, the problem is still the same. The old Muslim man shaking his head at your outfit, the visco girl glaring at you at the coffee shop, the uppity couple that walks by you in church with their noses turned up. We're all suffering from the same thing. Bill Maher has a brutal criticism of Christian hypocrisy in this video.
Jesus lays on that hippie stuff pretty thick. He has lines like, do not repay evil with evil, and do not take revenge on someone who wrongs you. Really. It's in that book you hold up when you scream at gay people.
Just a warning to the sensitive ones, he doesn't pull any punches.
You know, there's interpreting, and then there's just ignoring. You're supposed to look at that figure of Christ on the cross and think, how could a man suffer like that and forgive? Not Romans are pussy, he still has his eyes.
The definition of hypocrisy and judgmentalism hasn't really ever changed, and it's not really any more or less of a problem than it ever has been. Our current culture deals with it by attacking it. Throughout history, they dealt with it by just trying to be really good at it. And Jesus' approach was to humbly accept the reality and depend on a perfect judge and savior. Question time. Were you ever hurt by hypocrisy or judgmentalism? Why does hypocrisy feel so bad, even though compared to other sins, it's kind of harmless? Can you remember a time you were hypocritical? Like the last time that you were hypocritical? How recent was that? And why do we do that? Even though we know it's wrong, even though it feels so gross. What would be different if you just surrendered all of your judgments to God? All of them. All right, that is a Sessions intro video. Kind of took longer than I thought. Don't know if I'll ever make one of these again, but if it's any help at all, let me know, and I will see you on Sunday night at Sessions.